Thank you, Jerson. Thank you, University of Sao Paulo. I run the program at Cal State University Dominguez Hills. We're building that program up. And there are a number of programs around the United States now, in Canada and so forth, that are really attempting to build up the skill set around dispute resolution. And so I welcome connections, contacts. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my email information. And this is an ongoing project. And so I welcome the connection, and discussion that we can have, because I really believe it's important to build up these programs. The program in negotiation at Harvard was really a leader in our field, and now we're seeing the programs develop in each of the countries, including here at University of Sao Paulo. And I think it's a really important thing to do, and really a time where this is so necessary. So it's just an extremely important project, and I want to invite you into that. And it's an ongoing project. In all of this, you say, why are we concerned about developing skills for dispute resolution? And I would say that what's really important is that we're still human beings, and that even if we have all this technology, we'll need the human beings behind it in any event. That human discernment is not something you can replicate or produce in the computer world, and I don't think it will be for the foreseeable future. So I think we're going to need the humans fixing problems and identifying, analyzing, and coming together to resolve matters. So it's, for me, let's put that question back to what do we want students to learn? And so I think there's three things that we have to think about. We want students to be adaptable in the new world that we're in. We want them to be accountable and understand this idea of flow in their work. And so this is particularly true for dispute resolution practitioners. They're going to have to be very adaptable to what's going on in the world out there. And so there we're talking about the idea of having different kinds of approaches to dispute resolution. So beyond arbitration. So what can universities do? So here I have a few pointers. I'd just like to run through these, and that basically is the gist of my talk. The universities need to partner with each other around dispute resolution and to develop these programs. And so we need to make exchanges for the universities themselves, or the students, cost effective. And so we're working on that and looking at ways we can have students, for example, come to the universities, be able to find cheap accommodation and the like. Second thing is the partnership with the private sector organizations, tech organizations, and NGOs. So dispute resolution programs in particular need to focus on the connection to, what's going on outside the university, in the community, not just in the university. This isn't a theoretical discipline like many others. It's much more applied, practice-based. The next thing is to enlarge the discussion, basically, that we need to look at interdisciplinary practices. So when we look at arbitration, that's often defined in a narrow way, but in fact, arbitration can be coupled with mediation, facilitation, fact-finding, and all the other many practices. And the field of dispute systems design, which is now emerging, is a place where we have the students develop and to design their own systems for dispute resolution. So to take that into organizations and into communities. And we're seeing now that organizations, communities are doing this. They're designing their own systems. So that connects with the world we're living in now, the technological world, because we're going to need more students who can design systems that are applicable, that are useful, and that are adaptive to the change. Next thing is the idea of moving away from the strict legal or adversarial model. I think a lot of us have been really victim to some extent of an overly legalistic framework in terms of dispute resolution, partly because law schools have taught what they knew, which was to produce an adversarial framework. And I think what we need to do is move our education to a more collaborative approach and to see many different skill sets like the spokes of a wheel, rather than simply having one adversarial skill set. Not to set aside the adversarial skill set altogether, but to recognize it as one set of skills. And so to have, for example, with courts and other bodies, to have dispute resolution programs that complement courts, for example, rather than competing with them. So all that skill set's necessary for the courses that we produce in these programs. I think it's important that we hire practitioners in these schools too. So instead of hiring professional, teachers who are coming with a theoretical background, it's really important to hire practitioners. And so that's what I've done at the University of California, basically, is to, the California state system is to hire practitioners. We have a U.S. ambassador, for example, who's teaching with us. We have people in particular areas that bring their expertise and knowledge. So that's how we can deal with some of the geopolitical things that are coming up, by having these people who have practice knowledge in these areas being able to disseminate it from their experience, from the ground up, rather than from the theoretical base that's often the case, that has been in these programs. Next thing is to think about indigenous practices, that in a lot of these, in the world of dispute resolution, in arbitration in particular, and other related fields, we've left out, I think, indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices. And so in our program, we're bringing back that into the curriculum. So we have a course in particular on indigenous practices, indigenous knowledge. So we think that brings that form of knowledge back into the equation. Indigenous groups are gaining more power and leverage. Somewhat in the United States, there's a renaissance of practices and communities who are now bringing back these practices. And they're going to be a voice in the dispute resolution world of the future. And so we're looking then to connect with them now, and we do that in our curriculum. I think we need to really have a lot more online dispute resolution possibilities for students to practice these programs. So in this case of Samba and others, we need to have the students coming into the classes practicing these skills before they leave the program. So if they do that, they go into the world with the skill set already. So they're not coming into it unfamiliar to the practice. And one of the biggest ones is the intercultural aspects of dispute resolution. We're going to need a lot more cultural knowledge, intercultural knowledge, as we globalize and as these technologies globalize. So we're putting that right into the curriculum as well. We're looking at ways to bring together these different cultural logics into the same space. It's extremely important to do it in order to get agreements. And it relates to the idea of what Jill's talking about, communication, and how the miscommunication can kill a deal so quickly and kill the possibility of future building together. So really important also. And the last point is to really build up a sense of professional ethics in the different practices. So what we've seen is the lack of focus on professional ethics. I think it's going to be crucial to have the focus on the different types of practices. So arbitration ethics differ from mediation ethics, that differ from fact-finding, investigation, working with organizations, OD, the people from OD. So we really need to refine and look at the different practices of ethics. Just give you a quick example. Sorry, I just have to get a glass of water here. For example, we often think about the perception of impartiality in arbitration, and so people have applied that to mediation. But in fact, mediation, some argue, doesn't work very well if you're impartial. In fact, you want this sort of multi-party partiality where you're working with parties and moving between parties. So there are different ethics, different logics for each practice, and I don't think we've been very well, done a good job in defining and pulling apart those different ethics that belong to each of the practices. So these are, in a nutshell, basically the recommendations I have for the programs, and so that are building dispute resolution as a practice, and to see dispute resolution generally as a more, as not simply a narrow practice of arbitration, but in fact it's a set of skills that connect to each other, but very distinct, but can work with each other. And so we need to professionalize the field in a sense, to have people take the field seriously, to see it as separate from lawyering. I'm a lawyer myself, but I really think that we need to build this field that's separate in a logic sense from strict legal practice. And so I invite the idea of having arbitrators who are not lawyers, for example, into the practice, and mediators and so forth, so that we have a more interdisciplinary practice. Those are my thoughts in a nutshell. I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.